There are 3 different types of ecotypes of orcas that travel through these waters over the course of the year. And worryingly, in the last number of years, we have heard that one of these populations, the southern resident killer whales, have been designated as being endangered. So scientists now know that these whales struggle to find enough food to eat, that they are vulnerable to many contaminants, that noise pollution and disruption from boats interfere with their hunt for prey. The federal 2021 management measures have been put in place to reduce the disturbance from boats and also to protect Chinook salmon, which is one of their key food sources. I'm really pleased to introduce Rachel Schoeler, Public Outreach Education Officer with Parks Canada, and Nadine Einarson, who's the Program Policy Analyst with Transport Canada, who will share with us their knowledge of the endangered resident killer whales, update us on the 2021 management measures, and the actions that we can take to help protect those whales. Welcome, Nadine. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Holly. I'm just going to not share my screen for a second while Nadine and I do our introduction so you can see us a bit better. As Angela said, my name is Rachel. I'm a Public Outreach and Education Officer with Parks Canada, and my focus is on all things southern resident killer whales, which is really exciting for me as I'm quite passionate about the ocean and all of the critters that call the ocean home. I love to explore all of our waterways by boat, by kayak, even sneak in some long distance swimming in there. And one of the most exciting parts of my job is that I get to connect with folks like you who share that passion, and we're able to connect on a similar message, which is really great. And with that, I will pass it over to Nadine to introduce herself too.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Nadine Einarson, and I work for Transport Canada. And like Rachel, my work focuses on southern resident killer whales, which is also exciting as I've had the chance, like was just said by Angela, to live along this coast for my whole life. So the southern residents have always been a big part of our culture here, and it's really exciting to work on ways that we can help protect them.
Great, thanks, Nadine. And I'd also like to give a thanks to Holly for her thoughtful land acknowledgement today. I would like to acknowledge that Nadine and I are both joining you virtually from Squamish, British Columbia, which lies within the Squamish Nation traditional territory. I know I have found myself very reflective over the last week and have taken it as a time to remind myself to listen. And as Holly mentioned before, feel humbled by the fact that I have the opportunity to listen and learn from generations of folks who have used and lived on these lands and waterways before us. Today, for the next 40 minutes, we are going to take you on a journey to learn more about southern resident killer whales. So I'm just going to share my screen here so folks can see what we're talking about. Nadine and I co-chair the Government of Canada Outreach and Education group focused on southern resident killer whales. And primarily, our focus is communicating with recreational boaters about the protection measures in place while they're on the water. But there are lots of ways that all individuals can play a role in protecting the endangered southern resident killer whales. Today, during our presentation, there will be some opportunities to interact with us via the chat. We'll ask you some questions, so it would be really nice if you could participate and provide some answers to our questions. And we'll talk for about half an hour or so there'll be lots of time at the end to hear any questions you have for us as well. And we're really looking forward to that. If you do need to get up and stretch, grab a glass of water, please do so. Whatever you need to keep yourself comfortable and your brain ready to listen and learn. All right, so with that, we're gonna get started with our first question. Who here has seen a killer whale before? If you don't mind sharing just in a few words or a sentence your story in the chat, we'd love to share. It may have been out in the wilds, it could have been on a ferry or a movie or a documentary. I can share my story and perhaps it will inspire some others to come in through the chat box. This past summer, I actually had the opportunity to see 2 killer whales go right past my cabin on Ruxton Island. I was eating breakfast and needless to say, it all ended up on the ground. I stood up really quickly, super excited, and just had eyes on these 2 whales, and it was so magical. And I think what really stood out for me in this moment was that the whales were about 1 kilometer away. I was watching them from shore. They were, you know, almost on the other side of the channel. But the awe and wonder of these killer whales is so grand that that can still be experienced from a distance, which is pretty cool. Here on the BC South Coast between Campbell River and just north of Ucluelet, all vessels, including boats, kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, need to keep 400 meters away from all killer whales. And outside of those areas, they need to keep 200 meters away. But I just think it's really like inspiring and, like I said, magical, that you can still feel that energy and that excitement to protect this species, even from such a distance. I'm seeing, whoops, oh no, I'm trying to read the chat, but it's scrolling. 1 second. I'm seeing so many awesome stories coming through. Seeing them off a sailboat, which is pretty cool. What else am I seeing in here? From the beach, lots of fishing with my dad in Tawasin. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a cool place to see them. Okay, this is, yes, okay. I see one comment that says that I've never seen a killer whale except in documentaries. It's my biggest dream. And like I said, one of my favorite parts of this job is that I get to connect with folks who have lots of different experiences. And I hear this often, there is this desire to see whales or experience seeing whales. So that's pretty cool. Fingers crossed that you get an opportunity to see them soon. And I will pass it to Nadine to share one of her stories too.
Thanks. So the most recent time I've seen a killer whale was probably within the last couple of years. Before that, I've definitely seen them on ferries before, which is always exciting, and everybody always rushes to the same side of the ferry to get a good look, and that's always been an amazing experience. But that hasn't happened for quite a while, and in the last couple of years before COVID, when I used to actually commute from Squamish into Vancouver most days of the week, I would do that drive every day. And one morning I was coming around a bend and I had a clear view of the water and I saw a killer whale from the highway. And I just couldn't believe my eyes. It almost felt like it wasn't real, because how could you see it from so far away? But it was so obvious and clear. And I was driving to work on helping protect these whales. And so I was so excited. I got to work and I told everyone I knew at work that I had seen one on my drive. And so every time that I drive past that same spot, which obviously hasn't been too much in the last year, but whenever I do, I still always kind of look and keep an eye out to see if maybe I'll see one again, even though I know the chances are pretty slim of it popping up in the exact same spot again.
You never know. You always have to keep your eyes out. We'll talk a bit about that later, about shore-based whale watching, and you know, when you're shore-based whale watching, the act of whale waiting or you know, just enjoying a spot while you're waiting for the whales to come by is also all part of the experience. Okay, so I am going to move on, and we're gonna I'm going to give a bit more context around location and the 3 different ecotypes that Angela was referencing. But one more question before we get into that. I just want to get a better sense of who's in the room. So if you don't mind just typing in the chat, what brought you here today? Maybe you are a recreational boater and you're looking to learn a bit more about the protection measures, or perhaps you're an aspiring marine biologist, or you just love orcas. It would just really help us out to understand who's with us today and some of your interests in killer whales. Okay, well, the first one, to learn more about the southern resident killer whales, and I'm seeing some fascination with orcas, just loving the oceans. Okay, this is all great. Thank you for your responses, really appreciate it. So the first thing we're going to chat about is the 3 different ecotypes that Angela was referencing at the beginning. So here in BC, there are 3 different types of killer whales that you may see. There's the offshore killer whales, which you can see on the right of this graphic. They're typically found offshore, and they're more generalists in terms of what they eat, and can often be found eating even rays and sharks, which is quite different from the other 2 ecotypes, which I'll reference. Offshore killer whales aren't as well known or studied as the other 2 ecotypes. We also have the bigs or transient killer whales, which you can see on the left-hand side of this graphic. Those are marine mammal eaters, so they'll eat like seals, for example. And we often see them in Howe Sound. I believe just recently there were bigs or transient killer whales in Howe Sound within the last week or so. And then in the middle of this graphic, you can see the residents. So we have northern residents and southern residents, and the residents are salmon eaters. And today we're going to talk specifically about the southern resident killer whales, which is an endangered species. So the southern resident killer whales only have 75 individuals remaining in their population. And here in this graphic, you can see a little bit more about what their family structure looks like. So now that we have a bit of a better understanding of what we're talking about, we're going to build a little bit of a sense of place. So here is a map which shows all of the Parks Canada locations in southern BC. So you can see in green on the west coast of Vancouver Island is Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. In yellow, that's Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. And then we also have 3 National Historic Sites. We have Fort Red Hill and Fiskard Lighthouse National Historic Site near Victoria. And then Fort Langley National Historic Site and the Gulf of Georgia Cannery National Historic Site just outside of Vancouver. And then also on this map, in the blue area, which hasn't actually been updated for 2021, but that blue area represents the 400-meter approach distance zone that I was referring to. So within those areas, you must keep 400 meters away from all killer whales. This year, we'll get into a little bit more, but Barkley Sound here and Howe Sound here are also included in the 400-meter approach distance. And then if you look really closely at this map, you'll see a thicker dark blue outline within that 400-meter approach distance zone, and that is the southern resident killer whale critical habitat. So from this map, you can get a sense of why Parks Canada has some involvement in raising awareness about southern resident killer whales and their protection. But as I mentioned earlier, it is a Government of Canada effort. So Parks Canada works collaboratively with Transport Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, in collaboration with Indigenous partners as well as external groups to work towards the protection of the species. And then on this next slide is a bit of a recap of a few things I've already said about southern resident killer whales. So as mentioned, they're a critically endangered species with only 75 individuals remaining. During the recreational boating season, they're typically found in the inland waters of Washington State and southern BC. And their critical habitat, which you saw from that map earlier, overlaps, well, you didn't see the shipping lanes, but does overlap with shipping lanes and a number of urban areas. So you think about Vancouver or Victoria, and if you go into the States, down into Seattle. So these are busy waters. And then another thing to consider is that killer whales and southern resident killer whales, they use sound extensively for communicating and hunting for food. So we have to think about how the noise from boats and all of our activities in the water might play a role in affecting the southern resident killer whales. All right, so next we're going to talk about the 3 key threats that the southern resident killer whales are currently facing. So this is going to be a skill testing question. Based on what I have said so far, I'm wondering if anybody in the room can guess what some of these threats may be. And then we'll walk through each one by one. So yeah, as mentioned, if based on what I've said so far, if anyone has any guesses on what a key threat might be to the southern resident killer whales. So I'm seeing not enough food, vessels, overfishing or diminished food availability, noise, fishing lines, lack of food, boats, shipping noise, vessels. Okay, this is great. Everyone's been listening. So I'm glad you're listening. And we're going to talk about these three key threats, but we really want you to walk away from this knowing that there are ways, or we all play a role in the protection of the species. So even though everything I've said so far and talking about these 3 key threats is challenging, it's hard to hear about an endangered species and the ways in which we as humans may play a role in those threats, but there's also ways that we can make a positive impact on them as well. Okay, so the first threat we're going to talk about is prey availability. So a couple of folks mentioned that. So as I said, southern resident killer whales primarily eat salmon, primarily Chinook salmon, and they are struggling to find enough food to eat. In addition, there is acoustic and physical disturbance from vessels, which was also mentioned by a number of folks in the chat. And as I mentioned before, noise makes it hard for killer whales to hunt and communicate with each other. And then one that I don't know was mentioned yet is contaminants. So Nadine and I aren't going to talk too much about contaminants today, but as an apex predator, killer whales are vulnerable to contaminants. So Nadine is going to share in the chat a link to the Environment and Climate Change Canada website, which talks in a bit more detail about the work that's going into reducing the threat of contaminants for southern resident killer whales. And I encourage you to take a look at that to learn a little bit more. We'll do our best to answer any questions that do come up, but it's definitely not an area where we have the most expertise. Okay, so as I said, I really want you to walk away from this presentation knowing that there are ways that we can all help protect the southern resident killer whales, and that there is work going into better understanding these 3 key threats and how they interact with each other and how they interact with the ecosystem as a whole. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Nadine to start us on this uplifting route to talk about some of the actions that we can take to protect the species.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, as she just mentioned, we're working to increase awareness on how we are trying to protect the endangered southern resident killer whales. So for any boaters on the call, the next few slides apply to you. And then we're going to also follow up a bit later in the presentation with actions that everybody can take to help protect whales and other marine wildlife. So in order to start working to address some of the 3 key threats that Rachel just spoke about, the Government of Canada has developed a number of management measures over the last few years. Some of them are mandatory and some are voluntary. So this is the third year in a row, 2021, that we're implementing these measures. They usually come into effect during the summer season when the southern residents are most present in these waters. And each year, engagement and consultation are very key to informing the decisions made about the measures. So this map on the screen is similar to the one that Rachel showed before, but it shows all the measures that are in place. And I'm going to take the next few slides to just quickly talk about each of the measures. So next slide, please. Great. So the first mandatory measure are interim sanctuary zones. So you can see there's two pictures on the slides, and on the left-hand side, there's a circle over the red area at Shorebased. So the interim sanctuary zones are areas where there is no boating and no fishing allowed. They're intended to reduce acoustic and physical disturbance from vessels, and they're in areas that have been known historically to be important to southern resident killer whales. They come into effect on June 1st, so a few days ago, and they stay in effect until November 30th. This measure was in place last year as well. So the first one is located at Shorebased, which is circled, and then on the other side of the slide, there are two more interim sanctuary zones located off of Pender Island and Saturna Island. So at Pender and Saturna, there is also a 20-meter transit corridor along the shoreline for human-powered vessels, so like kayaks and paddle boards, to transit along. And there are some exceptions for vessels entering those zones. I'm not going to list them all, but for instance, a vessel in distress or avoiding unforeseen danger, that type of thing. So there are a few exceptions, but as a general rule, vessels are not allowed to enter these zones, and there's no boating and no fishing allowed. Next slide. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the fishery measures, and these are put in place by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So they also come into effect over the summer months. The first, you can see the orange triangle again, right beside Shorebased. And these, the fishing measures there in the orange triangle are closed to recreational and commercial salmon fishing from July 16th to October 31st. The second is the yellow areas, the two yellows, 20-3 and 20-4, if you can see that on the screen. Also closed to recreational commercial salmon fishing from August 1st to October 31st. And then lastly, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see again Pender and Saturna Island, but this time the yellow areas are fishing closures. So this year, it's a new fishing protocol is being piloted. So the fishing closures on the Gulf Islands are going to be triggered based on the first confirmed presence of a southern resident killer whale. So once it's triggered, the fishing closure will remain in effect until October 31st as well. So there's a few different closures, and they start at kind of different times throughout the summer, and then they all remain in effect until October 31st. And so Fisheries and Oceans Canada is working super closely with the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's ECHO program and the DFO Whale Tracking Network to monitor and provide confirmed detections. So we are monitoring right now, and as soon as the first confirmed presence is found, then those closures will go into effect. Next slide. Okay, so Rachel's mentioned this a couple times. The last mandatory measure is the 400-meter approach distance. So this measure requires that all boats and vessels stay at least 400 meters away from any killer whale. It doesn't have to be a southern resident. Any killer whale you see, you have to stay 400 meters away. So it's the geographic area covered is the red area on the map, and Barkley Sound and Howe Sound are both circled there because they are newly included this year. So you can see it goes from Campbell River area down around the bottom of the island and back up the coast to just north of Ucluelet. And this measure is in effect from June 1st until May 31st. So it's essentially in effect year round. And so, yes, it's basically a yearly measure, but it is in effect under an interim order, which is a regulatory power of the minister. So it's not in effect permanently, but for now, year round. So one important thing to just note is that some whale watching and ecotourism companies have applied for authorizations to approach non-southern residents up to 200 meters. And like Rachel mentioned before, the 200 meters is the approach distance under the marine mammal regulations. And so outside of this red area on the map, everywhere else, you still have to stay 200 meters away from killer whales and other marine mammals. So, some whale watching ecotourism companies have authorizations to approach non-southern residents up to 200 meters. These vessels will have a purple flag and it will have the letters AV, authorized vessel, in the middle. And so it's important to note to not follow these boats because they might be closer than others are allowed. Next slide. So now that I've talked about the measures that we've put in place, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how boating affects whales. So all vessel types contribute to physical and acoustic disturbance, even vessels as small as and human-powered ones like kayaks or sailboats. So it's a shared responsibility of everybody to reduce the impact of vessels. In the summer months, the contribution of recreational boats can be significant in some parts of critical habitat, and BC has seen a really large increase in the number of recreational boaters in the past year. In addition, newer boaters might not be aware of safe boating practices, of the measures, the mandatory and voluntary measures in place. And these boats can pose a challenge because many of them are not equipped with AIS or other avenues of communication. And so we have fewer channels to communicate requirements as compared to commercial marine traffic. And also recreational boats do contribute to the majority of violations of the protection measures. So being closer than 400 meters or being in an interim sanctuary zone or the fishing measures. So it's just important to remember that everybody out on the water contributes to that physical and acoustic disturbance. And so it's very much a shared responsibility for everyone. Next slide. So we want to talk a little bit about how you can help both on and off the water. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Nadine. So we're jumping into a few actions that you can take even if you aren't a recreational boater or fisher or somebody who is out on the water. First, you can report any violations or incidents involving marine mammals to the Fisheries and Oceans Canada Observe, Record, and Report hotline. If you have video or photo of the violation, that's very helpful for the report for the officers. But please do know that you can reach out to this line at any time to report any violations or incidents. And you can be on shore and see an incident and report it as well.
So I mentioned a few times that the measures I was talking about were mandatory and that there were also voluntary measures. So these are the voluntary measures that are also in place. So stopping fishing when within 1,000 meters of killer whales, reducing your speed to less than 7 knots when within 1,000 meters of the nearest marine mammal, turning off fish finders and echo sounders, again, to help reduce that noise disturbance, and placing your engine in neutral and allowing an animal to pass if you find yourself within 400 meters of a killer whale. You know, you don't always know that an animal is going to pop up beside you. And so if you find yourself within that range, then the best thing to do is just, basically wait for the animal to pass and try to reduce the noise as much as possible.
And next up, we have shore-based whale watching and citizen science. So we've talked a little bit about shore-based whale watching already. The photo here on this slide was taken from East Point on Saturna Island within Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. And it's actually a location on the whale trail. If you haven't checked out the whale trail yet, I encourage you to take a look. You can visit at thewhaletrail.org, and they have locations all along the Pacific coast that are really great for shore-based whale watching. And then in addition to that, just a friendly reminder to always report your sightings of killer whales or any other marine mammal that you see. You can report them to the BC Cetacean Sighting Network. You can download the Whale Report app. That's the easiest way to report. Their app is really user-friendly and talks you through all of the information that's required or optional for submitting a report. You can also call in to submit a report as well. And an interesting thing about the BC Cetacean Sighting Network is that that information, I mean, is used in a lot of different ways. But there is a system called the Whale Report Alert System, which is for commercial mariners. And if you report a sighting through the BC Cetacean Sighting Network, it will go through the Whale Report app and alert those commercial mariners who are in a similar geographic area to let them know that there is a whale there. This gives them the opportunity, if it's safe to do so, to slow down or change their course to avoid the whales that are there. So yeah, your citizen science efforts and your reports do make a big difference. So I encourage you to download the app.
So as mentioned, the southern residents' primary prey is Chinook salmon, and they are struggling to find enough salmon to eat. So it's just important to remember to make sustainable seafood choices when you're purchasing it for yourself.
And I know we didn't really talk about contaminants, but disposing of your waste properly is key. We're all connected to the ocean. I know I'm talking to folks who mostly live along the coast, but even those of us who might not live right on the water, we're all connected. So it's important to take into consideration what you're putting down the drain, nothing plastic, nothing toxic down the drain. And if you're out for a picnic or a walk, remember to follow the leave no trace principles and pack out what you bring in so that there's nothing left behind.
And of course, follow us on social media. So there are Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, and Instagram accounts as well. And we do post updates and you'll receive all the latest information if you follow along.
And lastly, be an advocate and a storyteller and share your knowledge and your personal stories and share what you've learned today with your friends and with your family. It's conversations like these that can really spark, passion in folks. So never underestimate the power of your own knowledge and your own stories. And with that, I would like to ask one final question before we wrap it up. I know we've given a lot of information today, and we'll share some links in the chat afterwards to some of these calls to action that we discussed. But I'm curious, just from what everyone has heard from us today, if anyone is inspired to take a new action to protect southern resident killer whales, and if you are, what that action might be. Maybe it is, brushing up on the management measures, or being more cautious next time that you wash your car on your streets, and acknowledging that all of our drains are connected to the ocean too. Whatever it may be, it would be awesome if you could share that with us. Hearing those kinds of stories and connections from others helps to fill our cup too, and remind ourselves why we do the work that we do, and the importance of these types of conversations. And that's it for us for today. Like I said, we do have a lot of time left over for questions, so I am curious to hear from you too. I'm just opening up the chat now to see what folks are going to take action on. Let's just see. Learn how to identify different pods. Ooh, that's a really good one. The BC Cetacean Sighting Network has some good ID, like marine mammal ID, not cards, but like graphics. So I encourage you to check out their website for some of that. Be more mindful of what goes down the drain and into the seas. Yep, that's a really great one. Thank you for sharing. Tell people conversations are powerful. I can speak to our boating association and pass on information as well to my marina. That would be amazing. Yes, Marilyn, we would love to connect with you. We can share some resources with you as well. That would be really great. All right, well, with that, I think I'll pass it off to Holly to wrap things up, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. That was so great. Thanks so much, Rachel and Nadine. I personally learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. I like these like short little kind of powerful, inspiring presentations. They leave us feeling hopeful. Hopefully our minds are full of information and context. And one of the comments I just saw in terms of what we can kind of leave with is learning more about how to identify the different pods. And that does kind of lead back to one of the questions from Christine in the chat box earlier. She was asking about the relationship of the pods, the J, K, and L pods, and how that relationship it ties into this clan of southern resident killer whales. And if there's any way that you could extend that into, you know, if you saw a whale, how do you identify that it's a southern resident versus a northern resident, or a J pod versus an L pod, if there's ways to identify the individual whales?
I can do my best. I am not a whale expert or a someone who studies whales, but I can do my best. So the way that we tell apart individuals from southern resident killer whale populations, well, from killer whales in general, is their saddle patch. Lucky for me, I have props in my house, but this is a killer whale, and this is its saddle patch. So each killer whale has a unique saddle patch that has been identified by a number of really great researchers. And that's how they tie back to the individual. It's kind of like a thumbprint on a human. And then for JK and L pod, so for southern resident killer whales, they follow matrilineage. So they follow the females in their family, and that's kind of how they're structured. Is really challenging to find a good graphic that shows all of the different females in the population and how they're connected. But when a killer whale is born, they will stay with their mother for life. And their father will stay with their mother for life. So that means that the father isn't necessarily part of the calf's life, if that makes sense. And typically the families like JK and L will, they will like swim and communicate and forage separately, but there are situations where JK and L pod will come together. That's called a super pod. And there is a lot to still understand about what super pods are and why they happen. But just recently, there's been 3 births in the last little while, and for 2 of them, a super pod came together, with the idea being that they were celebrating that birth. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you for that answer. That's great. I will note that I actually have seen a super pod before, and I was on a ferry. We were going through Active Pass between Galliano and Main Island, and my grandfather was visiting from Ontario. And I think this might have been one of the first times he'd seen killer whales up close. And he was like, "Does this happen all the time?" And I'm like, "No." I was like crying. It was so cool to see that many whales together. Holy
that is amazing, Holly. That is very cool.
Yeah, very special. So I have a couple other questions. I see Claire just asked one, and Suzanne had asked one earlier, so I'll just go through those in order. Suzanne had a great question, which applies to us at the SCCA, but also anyone who's a part of another organization. She's wondering how organizations, you know, grassroots, boots on the ground type of organizations can help to amplify the messages of fishing closures, of distances from boats to whales. Like, how do we help to make this information more applicable and relevant and inspiring to people so that they understand it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm excited that there is enthusiasm to help share and amplify the work. There's lots of ways that you can be involved. So one thing that we are working on developing, which should be available in the next couple of weeks, is an outreach toolkit. And it includes resources from a number of organizations. So for example, the BC Cetacean Study Network, from the Marine Education Research Society, from Government of Canada. It includes information from folks across the border too. But it's basically your one-stop shop for all resources related to killer whales and other marine mammals. So if you are looking for resources to share while you're, out chatting with folks, that's a really great place to find materials. In addition to that, we have like posters and brochures and postcards with all of the information that we shared today that we'd be more than happy to share with you both digitally and to ship you physical copies if you'd like to hand them out or post them at key areas where you know that there's boaters or fishers. And of course, you can always contact us. Maybe Nadine, you can put the email address for the Southern Resident Killer Whale inbox in the chat. It is a generic email address, but it does go to us. So know that someone will read and respond to it. But that's just a great way to stay connected with us if you do have further questions or you're looking for additional resources.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. I hope that's useful for other people as well. Oh yeah, Nadine, do you have something to comment?
Yes, sorry. I was just trying to find the email address and pop it in the chat. So it's there now. If anybody wants to see, well, actually, if you want to see the electronic copies of our poster, brochure, postcard, I think Rachel probably just said, but they're on the DFO Southern Resident Killer Whale Management Measures website, which we'll post a link to. You can email me at the one I just put in the chat and request the physical copies. And I just wanted to add to what Rachel was saying. Also, you can reshare any of our social media on your accounts so that that message gets amplified further. And we also have a bulletin that goes out to our distribution list for updates on measures when they're coming into effect, and just it's a good place for resources. And so that can also, you can sign up for the bulletin. Maybe Rachel, you could pop that link. There's a link to sign up for it on one of the parks websites. And from there, if you have distribution lists, you can send that bulletin to your distribution list as well. Or if you have newsletters and you want to include anything about our measures in there, that's another avenue for helping share and amplify that message, which we very much appreciate.
Great, thanks, Nadine. We have a couple other questions in the chat box here. I'll just breeze them through. From Claire, she was wondering about the DFO zone closures and if DFO has also calculated and set aside a quota for Southern resident food, or if there's any plans to do that in the future.
I can take this one, Rachel. So I don't work for DFO, so I don't want to answer too much on their behalf, but what I do know is that they have a planned release of 1 million Chilliwack River Chinook salmon, hatchery salmon, to support Southern resident killer whale. And they also have continued efforts around Chinook conservation, so protection, restoration of habitat, addressing forage fish and salmon predation issues through their BC Chinook process and their Pacific salmon strategy. So there is very likely more information about those online on DFO's website.
That's great, thank you. We have another question here around shifting species ranges. So as climate change is impacting salmon ranges, maybe they're going farther north to get into cooler water. Do you suspect that that might change where the whales are in the next 10 or 20 years? Will they move? Do you expect, or is there any predictions on that?
Do you want me to start? I can start.
Sure.
I think that's a really great question. And I think even if you look at the 3 key threats right now, everything is just so connected. And of course, climate change plays a big part in that too, right? There are a lot of folks who are out there doing research to better understand the distribution patterns of Southern resident killer whales. from the Parks Canada perspective, we have a team in both Gulf Islands National Park Reserve and Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. So I have no idea what will happen in 10 or 20 years, but to know that there are people out there who are doing that research, and that if there is a shift, then of course, once there is science to back that up, then there will be shifts in, for example, there could be a shift in critical habitat, but the science would have to be there first to make a change like that.
Thank you. And that question was from Patty. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. Great question, Patty. Thank you. Billy is wondering why some whale watching companies are able to get an exemption for distances between them and whales in the wild.
Sure, so I can take that one. Whale watching companies and ecotourism companies have experts on board who are able to identify the different ecotypes. So they're able to identify if they are looking at a southern resident, looking at a transient, etc. So most of the population can't do that. Like Rachel was just describing, there's some resources out there for learning how to identify them, but these companies, that's their job. And so they have experts who are able to identify the ecotypes. So in that case, we are saying to everyone, stay 400 meters away, because you're not able to tell, probably most of the public, if you're 200 meters away from transient or 200 meters away from a southern resident, but those folks will be able to tell. And so they're still not allowed to approach southern residents. They have to stay 400 meters away. But if it's a transient, they can approach up to 200 meters because of their ability to differentiate between the ecotypes.
Thank you. We have some great questions coming through here. I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss any of them. So the next question, I believe, came in from Damien. So what additional protection measures would you like to see that aren't currently being implemented? That's a big one, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a big question. And it's a good question. I think it's always important to be thinking critically about what you see in place and what could be. I think for me personally, the challenge is that like science takes time, and the current management measures have only been in place for 3 years. And so it's hard to know which parts of them are most effective or which parts perhaps aren't as effective that could be adjusted. So I don't know, it's really hard for me to say what I wish could be implemented in addition. Kind of have to wait to see and better understand the effectiveness of the current measures to make a decision on that one. But it is a really good question. Thank you, Damien.
And our next question comes from the chair of the SCCA, Leanne. She potentially has seen some pretty disrespectful looking behavior and noise from boats here on the Sunshine Coast. And she's curious to know if there's any enforcement measures or officers within our specific region here that would be helping to enforce the law on boaters.
Sure, that's a good question. So there are a number of partners that work together on compliance and enforcement. They are in all the areas covered by the management measures, but they can't be there all the time. So we have DFO fishery officers, Parks Canada wardens, the RCMP Marine Unit, Canadian Coast Guard, and Transport Canada all work together on compliance and enforcement. We have folks that are out there on the water in boats. We also have TC and DFO aerial surveillance programs, so planes that are flying around for other purposes, but also help us monitor from the sky. Coast Guard also monitors through AIS and radar. So there are a number of tools that we can use for enforcement, like verbal warnings, warning letters, administrative monetary penalties, which are financial penalties. And there are a number of ways that we can do enforcement. And also, if you do see anything taking place that you think is inappropriate, like Rachel mentioned before, you can definitely send that information into the DFO Observe Record report line through email or phone number. Because yes, there are enforcement officers in the area, but as you can imagine, like the ocean is a big place and they can't be everywhere at once. So any information that goes into them, they can use, the better the information, the better chances they have of for investigating those potential violations and taking enforcement action on those. So if you see something, please send information in and it will help the enforcement officers with their investigations.
Thank you for that. We're nearing our 1 o'clock mark. So if anyone has, or 1 o'clock in this time zone, I think there's people in other time zones tuning in as well. But if anyone has questions, please pop them in now so we can try to get them in before too long. I have a question here from Angela, our MC, and maybe there's a concern. People have heard that the whale report app information goes directly to whale watching guides so that they know where the whales are. Is this true or is this a myth? I'm hoping it's a myth.
They can use the whale report alert app, but they actually prefer not to. They have their own app that they've developed, which is very similar to the whale report alert app that they use to report their own sightings. So no, the whale report alert app is not messaged out to the whale watchers, and they in fact don't really use it. They prefer to use their own system that they've developed.
That's great, thank you. And I actually also had another question, a personal question. I know there's a few different terms we refer to killer whales as killer whales or as orcas. In Shawshee-Shaflam, which is the local Seashaf language, it's Stalishan is the name for orca. And I'm wondering if you know the history behind the term killer whale. It's not a very nice name. and I know there's been different relationships that people have with the orcas over centuries. So what's the history behind that name? Why are they called killer whales?
This is a great question, Holly. I'll do my best to answer it. There is a lot of history behind it, but historically, or before we really understood killer whales, I mean, even if you look at a killer whale, they're an apex predator, so they are killers. But before we really understood killer whales, they were viewed as more as monsters, like something that might kill you. And if you look back in the history, there was definitely that fear. And I think especially here on the BC coast, there's really interesting history. And if you've ever read the book, The Killer Whale That Changed the World, if you haven't, I highly encourage that you do read it. It talks about the capture of Moby Doll. Moby Doll is captured off the coast of Saturna Island. And Moby Doll really helped change people's perspective of killer whales. There was this sense that or this fear that when they were hunting this killer whale, that their lives were at risk. And long story short, what happened was that they harpooned this whale and it was struggling. And some of the pod members came to what the harpoonist thought was to attack them. But the pod had come to support the whale that was injured. And this totally changed the view of killer whales. So I think since then, there's been this shift to using the term orca. However, orca also has weird background too. I don't know the specifics, but in Latin, it also means something about demons and killers. So it's complicated, but I think go with whatever makes you most comfortable. There's lots of really great words for killer whale, for orca, and yeah, it's important to understand the history, but also recognize that even though killer whale seems negative, they are predators, so it's good that they're able to hunt for their food and sustain themselves.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that context, Rachel. I appreciate it. I think we're probably at our time now. We've all been sitting on our butts for the past hour or so, and I really, really appreciate everyone tuning in and being a part of the presentation. And once again, thank you so much, Rachel and Nadine, for doing the presentation. It was really informative, and I really, really appreciate you both being a part of our film festival. So with that, I hope that everyone enjoyed this afternoon's webinar. If you did, I'd also like to put a little plug in here for the SCCA's conservation initiatives. If you would like to support us, we would be so appreciative of having a donation or an annual membership from you. I will just put a link in here to our donation and our membership pages if you'd like to join the SCCA and be a part of our community. I'll also remind you that if you've registered for the films, so the film festival and the webinars have 2 different registrations. So if you've registered for the films, you should have received an email late last night or early this morning giving you access to those films, and they're viewable from today until the 8th. And so please do tune in and watch some of those films. There's a few films that really directly relate to today's presentation. One of them is graciously provided to us from the She Shelf Nation. It's about the orca whale that washed up on the Sunshine Coast in 2016. He's a male orca. His name is Quitens Entisinku, which means guardian of the sea. It's a wonderful short film, so please go check that one out. And the 2 other feature films on whales are To Orcas with Love and The Whale and the Raven. So please go check those out. And if you have not yet registered for our films, I will just pop that link in the chat box now. So you can click the Eventbrite link to go and register for any of the films. Everything's totally free, and we really appreciate all the support that we've received to be able to host this film festival and these webinars. So with that, we look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow evening if you'd like to tune in for the webinar tomorrow on forage fish. Otherwise, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday and have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.